This is the review for Frederick Douglass assessment. Basically, the review will cover the narrative life of Frederick Douglass. So, in history, or historically, the wretchedness or the treatment of a slave is generally measured by whether they're hungry. I mean, clothing, physical abuse, those kind of things didn't matter as much, but the hunger was the big issue. The state that Frederick Douglass was born in was in Maryland. And it was common practice where Douglass grew up to take children away from their mothers at a very early age, basically to hinder the child's affection towards their mother, so that way they don't build a bond. Douglass's knowledge of his father basically included the fact that it was rumored that his father was white and that he could possibly be his master, although it was never officially proven. The custom situation is for raising infants who are slaves is generally they are cared for by either a slave woman who's basically too old for field labor or grandparents, but generally it's an elderly slave who can't physically work out in the fields anymore. The plantation, the home plantation, was owned by Colonel Lloyd, on which Douglass worked. Because Douglass's master, it was assumed, was Lloyd's clerk and superintendent, and the plantation was essentially in the South, the main seat of government, which had an adjoining connecting 20 farms that connected to it, so it was a very large location. The slave owner, whose ownership with the slave is master and father, were generally not treated better. In fact, they were treated worse because of that fact. An event that Frederick was forced to watch was called the Bloodstained Gate, or the entrance to the hell of slavery. And this was his first true encounter with beatings, when he watched his his aunt, who was whipped for dating another guy. Basically, the slaves who were most highly regarded on Colonel Lloyd's plantation were those who worked on the sloop or the boat, because they were the few that got to leave the actual plantation. It was misconstrued, the songs of the South that the slaves sung. People in the North believed they were songs of joy because they sounded so beautiful, and they thought that slaves were content and happiness. But the real fact is that the Negro hymns that the songs that the slaves sang were really songs of sadness. It was customary practice for slaves to argue and fight amongst themselves over whose owner was the richest, because as bad as it was being a slave, it was worse being a poor man's slave. When the overseer, Mr. Gore, committed the horrible crime of shooting Denby in the head, basically nothing happened to him. There was no real investigation by the police or anything like that. He simply was retained at his position. As a slave child, Douglass claimed that the thing he suffered for the most growing up was essentially cold. It was being cold. At 7 or 8 years, Douglass was sent to live in Baltimore, Maryland, with the Auld family. And essentially, the 3 of the happiest days of Douglass's life were spent when he found he was getting ready to go live with the Aulds, and he spent it cleaning and eating and getting clothes set up for him. His duties, basically, with the Auld, is essentially taking care of their son Thomas, and that was his only job. Douglass had 2 sisters and a brother on the Lloyd plantation, but essentially had no relationship with them, so leaving the plantation wasn't very difficult, leaving them behind, because he just simply didn't have a relationship with them. Mrs. Auld, when he first encountered her, was honestly a kind mistress, and she ended up over time becoming cold due to having a slave and the power over Douglass. Douglass learned that in order to, or the pathway from slavery to freedom, to free himself, came from literacy, learning to read and write. Mrs. Auld taught Douglass the ABCs. She didn't teach him how to read fluently or write at all, but she did teach him the very basics to get him started. When his mistress refused Douglass the opportunity to teach, he ended up teaching himself to read by going to the little boys in the street and challenging them to spelling games and things like that. Now,
Slave owners desired that their slaves do not learn to read and write because they made better workers when they were illiterate. And the general time frame that a slave can reveal their birthday, or how they determine it, is generally around planting, harvest times, somewhere in that neighborhood, dealing with the fields. Douglass observed a difference in the treatment of slaves in the city from what he witnessed on the plantation, because city slaves were almost a free man in comparison to those who worked on a plantation. Douglass would practice his writing, though, using Thomas Auld's used copybooks by tracing his wording. Well, the first time Douglass was ever advised to run away when he was in Baltimore and seek abolitionists was when he was helping two Irishmen unload stone from a boat. At the death of his master and next his daughter Lucretia, Douglass was then considered the great injustice was done to his grandmother, who basically was granted her freedom when she could no longer hardly take care of herself, and basically she died probably from starvation. The first severe whipping by Mr. Covey was because Douglass didn't know how to drive an oxen and cart, and so he was beaten severely for that. Douglass, when he was in his off time on the shores, would mourn and see the white sails of the ships of the Chesapeake Bay, because he knew that those ships were leaving the harbor and that they were free from the chains of slavery, and he yearned or longed to be on them. While he was in Covey's practice, when he ran away, essentially a fellow slave by the name of Sandy, the advice he gave him was to carry a root, saying that superstitiously it would protect him from being beaten. Of course, that didn't happen. So from the moment, the epiphany for Douglass, after he had his fight with Covey, where he fought him and basically refused to be beaten by him anymore, came when he decided that he was going to fight and get free. And from that moment on the fight, it took 4 years for that dream or that realization to come true. Douglass was 21 when he was a free man. So he was relatively young still and was 21. Douglass believed that religious slaveholders were worse than the regular slaveholders. They would use religion as a means to beat people. The slave owners discovered Douglass attempting to teach other slaves how to read the will of God, and they reacted by rushing on them with sticks and stones to break up basically his Sunday practice. Now, when Covey tied Douglass at his legs and hoisted him in the air to punish him, basically what Douglass did was he fought him off along with 2 other men. Now, the trade that Douglass learned after his return to Baltimore was he learned how to caulk. And the reason no man was charged during that time when he was working at his caulking, he was attacked severely on the boats, and he was kicked in the eye, and the reason that no one was in trouble was because no white man would testify on his behalf. So therefore, as far as they were concerned, it never happened. And the city into which Douglass first escaped was New York. And Frederick's last name before he changed it was Bailey. It was Frederick Bailey. Frederick's wife's name was Anna, that he married, and of course, what Douglass tried to teach other slaves in the final farm that he was enslaved at before he went away to freedom was he tried to teach them all how to read. What to do basically during holidays that masters would prefer to see their slaves do is they would like to see them drink a lot. Douglass punishes his master for taking away his privilege of hiring himself out, essentially by refusing to work, retaining his master's care. And so therefore, because he's not earning any new wages, his master basically would have him go back out and work. Okay, so it gets down to the last question, really, which is, and this is your essay question written in chunking format. After reading the narrative, how do you view the practice of slavery? Did you realize the cruelty and dehumanization of it by basically making a human into like cattle or property or something like that? Basically explain your answer and give examples. And that's it. Good luck on your assessment.